Happy Martin Luther King Day. I hope God is treating you well, you and your family well, and that you're blessed. The year is treating you well. Want to give a little bit of a background on Martin Luther King, his legacy and impact among the younger Black generations. IShowSpeed, his tour of Africa, all of the important connections to our Black history and the missing pieces to our identity as a culture. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15th, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia, into a segregated South shaped by racial terror, rigid hierarchy, and enforced silence. His birthplace was not merely a location, but a psychological landscape, one where Black life was constantly reminded of its place, quote unquote. Atlanta marketed itself as a city too busy to hate. Yet segregation, voter suppression, and racial violence were embedded into everyday life. King was born into contradiction, and that contradiction became the soil from which his moral clarity would grow. Growing up, King experienced racism not as an abstract concept, but as a personal rupture. One of the most formative moments of his childhood occurred when a white friend's parents forbade their son from playing with him after the age of 6. King later described this moment as deeply painful and confusing. It marked his first conscious awareness that society had assigned him inferiority. Research on King's autobiographical reflections shows that this early rejection planted both anger and inquiry. Why is this so? And who decides human worth? King's father, Martin Luther King Sr., was a powerful influence. As a pastor who openly challenged segregation, King Sr. modeled moral courage and defiance without bitterness. He taught young Martin that dignity was not granted by white society, but grounded in God given worth. This framework insulated King from internalizing inferiority while simultaneously sharpening his awareness of injustice. Studies of King's upbringing consistently note that this combination, exposure to racism paired with affirmations of intrinsic value, was critical in shaping his nonviolent philosophy. As a youth, King was intellectually gifted but emotionally burdened. He skipped grades, entered college at 15, and carried the weight of expectation early. Research into his adolescent writings reveals an internal struggle between despair and hope. He wrestled with the brutality of racism while searching for a moral response that would not destroy his soul. This tension would later mature into the belief that hatred corrodes the hater as much as the oppressed. King's early exposure to theology, philosophy, and global thought expanded his lens beyond American racism alone. He studied Gandhi, Christian ethics, and social philosophy, concluding that oppression was not merely personal prejudice, but systemic sin. His youth did not harden him into cynicism, it refined him into conviction. What emerged was a leader shaped by pain, disciplined by faith, and unwilling to accept either violence or submission as the final answer. King's assassination in 1968 sent a chilling message that still reverberates through Black consciousness. Moral courage does not guarantee safety. For younger African Americans, his murder became a cautionary tale etched into collective memory. Research on racial trauma shows that the killing of visible Black leaders produces intergenerational fear, an unspoken lesson that resistance invites retaliation, even when it is peaceful, principled, and rooted in love. This fear is intensified by the contradictions surrounding King's legacy. The same nation that celebrates him with monuments, quotes, and a federal holiday was also the environment that surveyed him, discredited him, and failed to protect him. His character was attacked before his body was taken. For young Black minds, this creates a psychological paradox. How can a country honor a man it once treated as a threat? The unresolved tension breeds confusion rather than closure. As a result, many young African Americans inherit both inspiration and inhibition. King represents moral bravery, yet his fate represents consequence. Research on social movement psychology confirms that when leaders are violently removed without accountability, successors often internalize restraint, silence, or self censorship. The question quietly shifts from what is right to what is safe. 5 impacts and messages sent to younger African Americans. 1. Courage is honored after it is neutralized. King's celebration teaches a troubling lesson. Society often praises justice only once it no longer disrupts power. For young African Americans, this signals that transformative voices are safer when they are no longer alive. Resistance carries a cost beyond the individual. King's assassination communicates that standing against oppression can endanger not just the leader, but their family, community, and legacy. This awareness can suppress activism before it ever begins. Moral leadership is welcomed symbolically, not structurally. The holiday version of King emphasizes unity while avoiding his critiques of capitalism, materialism, and systemic injustice. Younger generations learn that radical truth is often edited for comfort. Fear becomes an inherited emotion. Even without personal experience of 1968, many young African Americans carry the emotional residue of loss. Research on collective trauma shows that fear can be transmitted culturally, shaping behavior without explicit instruction. The struggle requires both vision and protection. Perhaps the most complex message is this: King's mission remains necessary, but the system that resisted him still exists. Younger African Americans are left to reconcile hope with caution, called to pursue justice while navigating the fear that history has proven rational. Martin Luther King Jr.'s life teaches that love can confront power. His death teaches that power rarely yields without violence. Holding both truths is emotionally heavy, but unavoidable. For younger African Americans, the task is not to abandon his mission out of fear, nor to romanticize sacrifice, but to build a future where courage no longer requires martyrdom. Very important, as this is a very confusing time that we're living in as a humanity. One thing I appreciate about IShowSpeed and his travels is the spark of curiosity and inspiration that Africa, our ancestors, our civil rights leaders, our elders has placed in the minds and the heart of our young people to explore Africa, to explore your history, to learn. It's one thing to see it on television, it's another thing to actually position yourself there firsthand. The recent travels of IShowSpeed across Africa, spanning South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, Egypt, Morocco, Angola, Botswana, Eswatini, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Algeria, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Namibia, Senegal, and Benin represent more than entertainment or tourism. These visits have become a cultural intervention. For many African Americans, Africa has long existed as an abstract idea shaped by textbooks, media stereotypes, colonial narratives, and the rupture of the transatlantic slave systems. Speed's presence on the ground, interacting with everyday people, languages, humor, food, poverty, wealth, joy, and contradictions, collapses that distance. It reframes Africa not as a monolith or a distant origin myth, but as a living, diverse, modern, and historically layered continent. A deep divide has existed for generations between Africans and African Americans, one not born naturally, but cultivated through historical misinterpretations, colonial psychological warfare, and deliberate systems of separation. Enslaved Africans were stripped of ethnic identity, language, and homeland, while Africans on the continent were later subjugated and subjected to European partition, racial hierarchies, and cultural reprogramming. Over time, both groups inherited distorted views of one another. Speed's travels unintentionally confront this fracture by showing Africans laughing, critiquing, embracing, and questioning an African American figure in real time. The illusion of otherness begins to weaken. What emerges is recognition, shared ancestry, expressed through different historical paths. Speed's visits also expose the diversity of African historical narratives. Egypt challenges myths that divorce African civilization from Blackness. Ethiopia disrupts the false belief that Africa was uniformly conquered. Nigeria and Ghana highlight pre colonial empires, intellectual traditions, and the violent rupture caused by European extraction. Southern African nations reveal how land theft, mineral exploitation, and apartheid era systems reshape economies and identities. North African regions complicate simplistic racial binaries through centuries of migration, conquest, trade, and cultural fusion. Africa's face today is not evidence of lack of history, but proof of constant historical collision. Colonialism and the transatlantic slave system reorganized African economies to serve external powers. Borders were drawn without regard to ethnicity or culture. Education systems erase indigenous knowledge. Christianity and European languages were weaponized as tools of control. Meanwhile, African Americans were forced to build a new culture in captivity, one that carried African rhythms, spirituality, and resistance without geographic continuity. Speed's content, often raw and unfiltered, accidentally reveals this shared wound. The laughter, misunderstandings, and moments of connection all sit on top of centuries imposed disconnection. 7 points on the historical impact of Africa and African Americans. One, Africa as the foundation of global civilization. Africa is home to some of the world's most earliest civilizations, universities, and scientific traditions. From Nile Valley engineering to West African metallurgy and philosophy, Africans shaped human progress long before Europe's rise. These contributions were systematically minimized to justify enslavement and colonization. African Americans inherited this erased legacy without access to its full record. The denial of Africa's intellectual history became a psychological weapon, convincing generations that Black achievement began in bondage rather than before it. Slavery did not exploit labor, it deliberately severed memory, language, and identity. Africans were transformed into commodities, while Africans on the continent were destabilized by raids, warfare, and European interference. This created parallel Black histories, one forged in captivity, one under colonial domination. The resulting misunderstandings between Africans and African Americans are symptoms of this engineered rupture, not evidence of natural division. European powers reorganized African economies around extraction, gold, diamonds, oil, and labor, rather than self sustaining development. Borders were drawn to weaken unity and increase dependence. African Americans experienced a similar economic extraction through sharecropping, redlining, mass incarceration. Both groups were inserted into systems designed to limit generational wealth and autonomy. But despite oppression, African culture survived through music, spirituality, language patterns, and resistance. African Americans transformed African rhythms into blues, jazz, gospel, hip hop, and protest movements. Across Africa, traditional practices adapted under colonial pressure. These parallel evolutions demonstrate resilience, not loss. Difference does not negate connection. It proves survival under different conditions.